Hello, this is the Lord's Legion and welcome to a brand new movie review, and this is actually going to be the first review that will be a part of the new series known as The Path to Infinity War. And this series is pretty straightforward. As a matter of fact, I will be reviewing each and every film within the Marvel Cinematic Universe from Iron Man all the way up to Spider-Man Homecoming, as Spider-Man Homecoming is the last film in the MCU I haven't even reviewed yet. And in case anyone's wondering about the Thor Ragnarok or Black Panther reviews, I've already done them quite recently, so you can check them out. And I'll try and pump out a new review every 2 to 3 days, just so that we can keep things consistent. But in this review, we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning, and what better place than Iron Man 1. Now this film is incredibly important to the MCU, as this is the very first film to kickstart the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And also, given the situation of Marvel Studios at this point in time, this was extremely important to them, because in a way, Iron Man was their last ditch effort in saving the Marvel brand. But the real question is, does Iron Man still hold up after almost 10 years? And after all this time, Iron Man still really holds up well. And if anything, Iron Man is actually stronger than most of the other MCU films. Now, as far as the story goes, Tony Stark is a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist who only really cared about making money and selling some of his technology. But after witnessing firsthand as to how his technology can affect other lives, Tony finally decides to stop weaponizing his technology and ultimately use his technology for good instead, thus leading to his transformation as Iron Man. And although for the most part that the story is just a basic origin story, the reason why it works so well is purely on the character of Tony Stark, because he is unlike most other superheroes at the time, or at the very least the other superheroes that we've seen on film before. And speaking of Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. embodies Tony Stark, and it really goes without saying at this point. And he really does balance out both the dickhead side of Tony Stark as well as the more likable side of the character as well. And never once does Tony Stark ever come across as unlikable, because in the end you just want to see this character mature more as a person. Now, in terms of the MCU's first main villain, Jeff Bridges did a pretty good job as Obadiah Stane. And as far as the story goes, he is a pretty good mirror to Tony Stark, as Obadiah Stane is pretty much what Tony doesn't want to end up becoming. And although his transformation as the Ironmonger was a little too rushed to me in the third act, he was still a solid villain regardless. Gwyneth Paltrow as Pepper Potts was also a welcomed addition in the movie. And what I like about Pepper Potts is the fact that she's not really like most of the other love interests. She's smart, level-headed, and grounded. And at least she's not like a Mary Jane Watson. And the less I talk about Terrence Howard as Rhodey, the better, because he was such a huge plank of wood. And it was so clear throughout the movie that he was only really there for the paycheck. The only thing left I have to say about this is that I am more than grateful that Terrence Howard never donned the War Machine costume. Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury was a pleasant surprise despite how he was only in the end credits scene. But you know, I had to mention him somewhere in this review. And lastly, Sean Fube as Yinsen really does deserve a mention here, as he does play a huge part in Iron Man's creation. And despite his limited screen time, we do really care about Yinsen as a character. Now, on the whole, the action and the effects actually still hold up to this very day, because it was clear that the movie had to use practical effects as well as using some CGI, because majority of the Phase 1 movies had a much smaller budget in comparison to what we normally get later down the line. And despite all of that, I still believe that the first film does really age well in terms of effects. And speaking of all the armors, it was really cool to see all of the armors have their own time to shine. We have the Mark 1 escaping from the 10 rings, and then we also had Mark 2 flying for the first time, and then we even saw Mark 3 holding its very own against a group of terrorists. And each of these scenes really do stand out in terms of the MCU as well as this very movie. And it is true that majority of the Phase 1 films suffer from that grounded tone, but when it comes down to Iron Man and his world, it does actually make sense. And in a way, this movie actually embraces the tone. And the best part about Iron Man is the fact that it really does stand on its own 2 feet. And despite some of the subtle Easter eggs, it never once distracts the overall arc. And this is a big problem that plagues most of the MCU films after Iron Man. But at the end of the day, Iron Man 1 is such a solid movie in its own right. And I have always been a huge fan of the first Iron Man film, but the more you read into the history of the MCU, as well as the more you get to watch the film, the more you can actually appreciate it for what it is. Because Iron Man really did set the bar high for comic book films. And the film itself did pretty much everything that it was set out to do. So because of a very solid cast, for the most part at least, as well as a pretty intriguing origin story, not to mention how Iron Man actually aged very well after 10 years, and just how influential Iron Man really is as a movie, this is why the final verdict for Iron Man 1 is a much deserved 9 out of 10. And it is pretty easy to see why many people do deem Iron Man 1 as a huge classic within the comic book community. And at the end of the day, it is very well deserved because Iron Man is such a solid movie on its own. And even if you're not a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's quite a lot to enjoy with Iron Man. So how do you feel about Iron Man 1? Do you enjoy the movie? Do you think it's a tad overrated? And where would you personally rank it within all of the MCU films? Comment below and share some thoughts. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Don't forget to look out for the Incredible Hulk review, as that should be out within the next 2 to 3 days. Take care and have a good one.